What should the offering of the poor to God be like? Actions that occur in the sky are didactically represented in rituals determined as the shadow of celestial facts. These shadows need physical objects for man to observe, and sometimes they cannot be acquired because of people's poverty. Thus God has used alterations by limiting the poor, not because the right is changed, but because love can understand the difficulty of every person in the world in which he lives. Thus we have if their possessions are not enough for small cattle 1, the limit is not in God is in man. If man cannot have small cattle, then God delimits a necessary factor for man. This can be seen in other facts. For example, David ate of the holy loaves. They ate the loaves of the proposition, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor to his fellows, but only to the priests, and even the priests worked on the Sabbath. Law that on Saturdays the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath, and are without blame. All these factors are linked to needs. One of the basic rules of everything is that a need is not a rule. So when you are hungry and at risk of death, you can eat the holy bread, but this is not to eat, it is a case of necessity. So if the priest does not light the fire in the sanctuary on Saturdays, or does he put out who would light the fire for the sacrifice? In other words, the limiting can never determine the whole. For example, the rituals of Yom Kippur were performed by the shrine, and throughout the year the shrine prepared for the Day of Atonement. The shrine, unlike a poor person, was made up of many people's gift possessions, so the ritual system could not be made different from the established rule. Whether it was goats, fire, or any material in the rite, there was no shortage, and in fact it cannot compare with a starving person, or one who has no money for sheep, or small cattle. In fact, a person who tries to idealize that except for an individual's poverty, is brought to the wealthy priests, has a rational problem, idealizing that when giving alms to a poor man, he should automatically set aside such money for a rich man, which really tends to be a deviation of reason. When we read about the doves offered to God, we have a lack of blood for the altar. And so it is necessary to draw the blood from a dove, to the point of falling on the altar. If you use only one dove and offer like a lamb, blood would not fall on the altar like the lamb. Thus one is the extraction of the blood, and the other the ritual in an attempt to resemble the lamb. But why did this happen? Because of the poverty of the individual who wanted to participate in the sacrifice and could not. So if it had money, that was not the ritual to do. It may be noted that if poverty is at greater levels, we have the term, "He shall bring the 10th part of an ephah of flour for a sin offering. He shall not pour oil on it, nor put frankincense upon it, for it is a sin offering." In other words, we have flour as an offering. Why? Because the person is poor. What is the right offer? A small cattle. And what was the dice? Flour. Then we will build that because of man's need. Then the rule would be to represent Jesus as flour? No way. Nor, where there is no need because of poverty or difficulty, will we say that one ritual is another. Therefore, kindness to the needy is not an excuse to break the rules, but to understand the difficulty of the people. So then what is the meaning of offering a dove or meal for sin offering in the priestly concept? Therefore, it represents that God understands the poverty of man and tries to adjust factors for the man to feel participant, even being poor. Because it is a change from the shadow ideal, it would be the shadow of the shadow. just as the shadow cannot be more complete than the real, and the shadow of the shadow cannot be more complete than the shadow. Therefore, the shadow determines that, and without shedding of blood there is no remission. 3. Now does the shadow of the shadow because of poverty determine to offer flour? Yes. Now then, the term without bloodshed there is no remission, of course not. The shadow of the shadow does not nullify the shadow, so that the shadow does not nullify the true. Therefore, if there were no poverty, the shadow would be offered, and the shadow could not be made. In fact, one cannot nullify the shadow by observing the shadow of the shadow, so the shadow of the shadow that surrounds flour cannot overcome the shadow of the Lamb, nor can the Lamb cancel the sacrifice of Jesus. Note that to be able to observe that a thing is shadow of shadow, one must have an organization of texts that clearly demarcate that such is the shadow of shadow. Therefore, it is easy to know that the flour in the text is a shadow of the sin offering made by the small cattle. It is therefore a factor entirely of a concept of ignorance to try to see the shadow of a subject's shadow, and to try to undo the shadow of another subject, because there was shadow other than the shadow. In fact, for example, the Yom Kippur goats are linked to a rich group. Generating the shadow, comparing flour to the goat, would determine that shadow is more important than shadow, and that is an irrational action. In other words, there is no excuse for the rich group not to offer what it can offer. Therefore, the foundation of the concept of dove and flour is linked to poverty. The core of the texts is to adapt the poor, since the goat does not have the function of adjusting the poor, because the group in action is rich. So to say that a poor person has the same chances of getting an object is extremely a factor of ignorance. So much so that God set standards for the poor. Thus the use of flour as a sin offering is not wrong if one has no possessions, but the correct shadow is to offer small cattle.
If you are looking for more content from different areas, visit the reformadorstazad.com website. News and detailed content can be found. With system of research and organization of text and video.